Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark. In today's video I'm going to continue my work on the Mariner's Compass Tarnished Star quilt pattern. If you haven't already seen it, you might also be interested in part 2, the previous video, in which I worked on this 16-inch 16-point Fat Robin Compass Sunflower. It's the part in the center of this large block. In today's video I'm going to focus on making these 8-inch by 18-inch 16-point Fat Robin half compass blocks, and I have that highlighted here on the screen. Here's a closer look at what the block is supposed to look like, and you can see here that there are 2 color variations on this block. We'll be making 4 from one colorway and 4 from the other. I also have laid out here on the sewing table all of the strips that I'll be using, and you can see that I have background strips and also 0.1 strips, 0.2 strips, and 0.3 strips. And lastly, I have these half circle centers that will go in the very middle of the block. If you're working on this quilt yourself and you have the pattern, these cutting instructions for this set of strips and the half circles, those can be found on page 1 of the pattern. We're starting off in our pattern on page 5 under point 3, and this tells us we're going to be following the Mariner's Compass instructions in the accompanying manual, as well as the specific instructions for half compass blocks on page 16. I'm starting off here with the background fabric strips and the 0.1 strip, and I'm going to follow the instructions on page 4 in the manual under compass construction. I'm just cutting off the selvage to make the first step a little easier as we're marking where to start joining the 2 strips together on an angle. Before I join my strips together, I'm going to just press out these creases. Since we're using strips from with the fabric, we have this crease where the fabric was folded. Here on step 3, we're lining up the 60-degree angle with the bottom edge of the background strip and the top edge of the ruler with the corner of our strip at the top. And we're making a mark. This is giving us our starting point to join our 0.1 strip. And you can decide whether or not you want to pin. I just like to pin it. You move it around the table, things shift around. You don't have to look at it that way. And we'll join our 2 strips together, and as we go throughout this block, we'll make sure to pay close attention to our 1/4-inch seam allowance. Just pressing the seam of my strip set towards the dark and paying attention to keep the strip set straight while pressing. So for steps 5 and 6, we're lining up our 60-degree angle with the seam and making sure that we're clear of the end on both strips of fabric, and then we'll cut our 60-degree angle. For steps 7 and 8, we've turned the strip set over with the background fabric on the bottom, and we're cutting the width of our units the same width as we cut our background fabric strip. So we'll just follow that angle that we've established and cut the width. Since we know the strip set can distort as we go down cutting our units out of the strip set, we can double check our angle, putting the 60-degree angle on our seam and checking the edge to make sure that it's holding the angle. If not, then we can turn the strip around and recut that angle before we continue cutting out more units. I continued the cutting, and here we have all the units cut out of the strip set. For step 9, we're going to cut off the background triangles. We'll take our ruler, we'll lay the 1/4-inch line at the top where the 2 seams come together, and the bottom edge of the ruler we'll put right on the point, the corner of that background strip. If you make the cut correctly, you should see this little tiny bit of the 0.1 strip on the very tip of that triangle. Otherwise, you probably didn't cut it right. So here you can see I have all those triangles cut and the remainder of the unit to the right. At this point, we need to get out our Fat Robin 60-degree compass ruler for making some of the cuts on these units. Step 10 is the first cut, so we'll be using kite B, and we'll be lining up the size of block. There's solid lines on the left-hand side of the kite. So we'll find the line that corresponds to our size, and we'll line that up with the seam. And then we also want to line up the dashed line with the bottom edge of that 0.1 strip there in the camera view. And once our first cut is made, the unit will look like this. Now to do the second cut, which is step 11, still on page 7 under compass construction, we're going to be using the other side of the ruler to locate our size marking. And we notice that we have those sizes down the right hand side of the ruler. We'll locate 18 there, and then we'll line the solid line all the way on the left of the kite with the seam, and then the center line should line up with the point, the bottom point of our unit there. After the second cut, the unit will look like this. And here I've completed cutting the 2 cuts on the units to the right, and then of course the triangles that we cut previously. Now we're continuing on page 8 with steps 12 through 14. And notice the orientation of the triangles and the units that we previously prepared. For alignment purposes, we're going to pay attention to the very top. And so since this is going to unfold with those 2 angles once we press it, we have to leave that little point at the top for that angle to come out right. And I'm just measuring from the edge to where the 2 fabrics meet to make sure that's a 1/4 inch. And of course we want our 1/4 inch seam to be accurate as well. So we'll start there, we can pin it, and we can just join these together. We can do chain piecing if we like. Just going to press these towards the dark. And here are all those pie units completed. Now we're on page 9 under compass construction, and we're on step 16. Now remember, we're doing 2 different color variations, so we're going to divide our pies up to the 2 different colors of strips for point 2. And our pattern gives us a good reminder. Again, in the pattern, we're on page 5 under point 3, and towards the end of that paragraph it tells us that, and we're going to continue through steps 23 to make 8 big pies using color 1 and 8 big pies using color 2. On page 9 in our manual in step 16, it's explained how we'll orient one of the pies like this, wrong side facing us, so that we can determine our starting point for joining pies to the point 2 strips. So once we have that aligned with the top edge like that, we'll just make a mark. Now that we have our mark, we can just turn the pie around and notice the orientation now. It's still wrong side towards us, but notice that that point of the middle fabric is down towards the bottom of the strip, where our starting point is at. And we can just pin this to the strip. I just went ahead and pinned a starter unit to each of the 4 strips that we're using, 2 from each color. It might also be helpful to lay all the pies oriented the proper way. And then as we join one to a strip, as we put the next one on, we can leave 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in between them. And that way we'll have plenty of room to do our cut without cutting into the adjacent unit. We've advanced to step 18 on page 9 in the manual, and we're doing our pressing. So we're just pressing the pies away from the strip, and again trying to keep the strip straight as we do this pressing so as not to distort anything. Now still on page 9 in the manual, we're on step 19. So we've rotated the strip so that the point 2 strip is at the top. And the way we're going to cut this is one of 2 ways. If we have the angle ruler, we can place the 60-degree angle on the point 1 seam line. And we'll be cutting flush on the right hand side. And we're not cutting the pie, we're just cutting that point 2 strip. And this is what these units will look like after we get each one cut out. Another option for making this cut is to use the angle ruler's 82.5 degree angle on the point 2 seam line. And here I have all of those units cut out from those strip sets, completing step 19 on page 9. Continuing in the manual under compass construction on page 10, now we're going to take these units we made and we're going to do 2 cuts to make shaped units. Again, we're using our 60-degree compass ruler to do this, but this time we're using kite A. On the left-hand side of kite A, we're going to find the size that corresponds to our block, which is 18 inches. We're going to line that solid line up with the seam on our unit, this seam right here. And then we have that dashed line at the bottom of the kite. We'll line that up with this bottom edge of the unit. After the first cut, the unit will look like this. For step 21, to make our second cut, we'll find our size 18 on the right hand side. Notice that dashed line. We'll be lining that up with this edge of our unit. And then we'll find the center line, and that will line up with the point at the bottom. And then the solid line at the left, we'll line that solid line up with our seam right here. And once we make the second cut, the unit will look like this. And here you can see I've applied those 2 cuts to all the units for the 2 color variations, and we have all our shaped units completed. Moving on to step 22 on page 11. Now we're going to join these pies that we reserved to these shaped units to make big pies. Similar to when we were joining the pies together earlier, when we join these big pies, we're checking this edge. It's on an angle for 1/4 inch, right? Because if we don't check that, when we press this open, it may not be straight or flush down the edge. So we can just pin it at the top and bottom, and then we can chain piece these like we did before. And again, we'll press these with the pie we just joined to the outside. And here we have all of our big pies pressed, completing step 23 on page 11 in the manual. Here on page 11 in the manual, as we move on to steps 24 and 25, we're going to be taking 4 of the big pies from each color variation and joining them to the 0.3 strip. Take note of the orientation of the big pie. We have the wrong side of it facing us, and we're going to lay it on the 0.3 strip. We're going to leave 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch at the end there, and we'll just pin the first one. And then as we join the other big pies to the 0.3 strip, we'll just leave about 1/4 to 1/2 inch space in between each one. And now we'll join all these together. And now we'll just press these with the pie to the left and keeping them as straight as we can as we go. And this is step 26 in the manual on page 12. It's step 27 on page 12 in the manual. We're cutting the units from the strip set. And we're just setting our ruler on a 90-degree angle with the seam. And we're also making the right side of the ruler about 1/4 inch from the edge of where the big pie meets the 0.3 strip. And once cut, the unit will look like this. Now we're to the last step under the compass construction section on page 12, step 28, where we're making a cut. We're using kite B from our ruler. We're going to be using this line on the left to find the size that corresponds to our block, which is 18. We're going to line that marker, that 18-inch marker on that line, up with the seam where the 0.1 strip matches the background fabric. Be aware that the ruler doesn't reach the bottom edge of the fabric here where I'm making the cut. So while I didn't do it here in this demonstration, you might want to lay another ruler on the right hand side of that once you make the top part of the cut, and then cut the bottom. I kind of cut on a little bit of an angle there at the bottom, but this is going to be covered up by the other pie that gets joined to this anyways. And here are all 8 of the units, 4 from one color variation and 4 from the other, all with that cut applied. Now in the manual, we need to shift over to page 16. This is half compass blocks plus finishing. So these are special instructions for finishing these half compass blocks. In steps 8 and 9, we're supposed to take a cut length of the 0.3 strip and join to the bottom of these 2 units. The instructions mention referring to the detailed cutting chart on page 14 of the manual to get the dimensions of these 0.3 strips. I could find the width there, but I didn't find the length. So I held the ruler up to these 2 units. I measured them and I came up with, I think, about 10 inches to leave some extra fabric on each end. And since we need 8 of these for each color variation, and we have 2 strips for each color variation, and those strips are with the fabric, so around 42 inches, so it came out just right. And here you can see I have those 8 rectangles ready to go. Just now showing you those pieces laid out here on the sewing table for steps 8 and 9 on page 16. We're joining these 2 rectangles to each of the units that form the halves of our half compass. Here you can see I have those rectangles pinned to each of the units, and I did allow a little bit of overlap at the outside edge, the outside of the compass on both units. Time to join all these rectangles to all these units that we have ready for the half compass. One important reminder here, join the correct color variation 0.3 strip to the units that you're working with. And we'll quickly press these. On page 16 in the manual, step 10 is telling us to join these two halves together now. And just going to leave the point sticking up above, similar to how the other parts of the sunflower or compass join together, and pin these two units together. Now that we have them all pinned, we can just go through and join all these units together to form our half compasses. Step 11 on page 16 is wanting us to cut the bottom edge of the half compass. So that'll be cutting across those two rectangular strips we joined to the bottom of those two units. But I thought first it might be good to starch this whole thing, because that way we know that everything's laying nice and flat before we go making that cut. Given that we're dealing with so much fabric that's been cut on the bias, I'm just pressing down, raising the iron up, pressing down again in another spot, instead of moving the iron around on the fabric. Page 16 in the manual, steps 8 and 9, tell us that we're going to put 2 pin marks that allow us to make our bottom cut on the half compass block. We'll be marking the left-hand side of the block with the kite B looking at the wrong side of the ruler. And notice this arrow pointing to the very bottom tip of kite B. That is where our pin will actually go to mark the fabric. And then the line that runs between these two arrow tips, the leftmost line of kite B, we'll be lining that up with the seam. And then we'll also be lining up this 18 mark on that same line with the 0.1 seam line on our block. Here's a look with the ruler on the fabric. Here's that bottom point of kite B. And here you can see between the two arrow tips, the leftmost line of the kite lined up with the seam. And then lastly, we're lining up the 18 mark, the size of our block, on that same line with the 0.1 seam line. Now we'll just slide the pin underneath the ruler to where it lines up with the point of kite B. Then we can move the ruler out of our way and stick the pin through the fabric. When marking the right side of the block, we can use the right side of the ruler. And again, we're still using kite B, but here's the bottom point. And then again, we'll be lining up the line on the rightmost side of kite B with our seam. And on that same line, we'll line up the 18 mark size of our block with the 0.1 seam line. And here's a look at that with the ruler on the fabric. Here's the bottom point of the kite B. And here between the points of the arrows, you can see how I have the line lined up on that seam. And then lastly, I have the 18-inch mark lined up with the 0.1 seam line. And again, we just slide a pin under the ruler and line it up with the end of kite B there, the point. And then we can move the ruler and stick the pin through the fabric. And since we don't want to put a ruler on here to do our cut with 2 pins in it, we'll just do a mark on the fabric where the pins are at. An important reminder for step 11 on page 16 to do this cut. Don't make the mistake of lining up the edge of the ruler with these marks, because we're lining up the line that's a 1/4 inch from the edge of your ruler with these marks. So that's leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this edge. So let's turn it so we can take a quick look at it once we have that edge cut. And also, here's that half circle that's going to go on the center of the block. So our next step is going to be to prepare the block for adding this applique half circle. One important reminder, before we join the two halves together, you know how we join these strips on to the units? We're joining these strips on, right? One thing that would be easy to do is to mismatch these colors accidentally. So we want to make sure this color in the center on this point, we're using the same color strips when we join these strips, because we're doing 2 different color variations with these half compass circles. Here's a quick look at one of the units in that other color variation. And here are all 8 of those units in the 2 color variations. Next, I need to add the center half circle. To get these 8 blocks ready to add that applique half circle, I've traced a half circle onto freezer paper. I'm going to cut this out and then I'll iron this onto each of those blocks and cut out this excess fabric in the middle. I'm leaving around a 1/2 inch margin around the edge in what I'm going to cut out of the middle of that block, and this will allow us to center the half circle when we applique it. So I'll just try to center the freezer paper half circle and then press it onto the block. Now we'll just go ahead and cut this out following the edge of our freezer paper template. So now that we have that excess fabric removed from the center of our block, it'll make our applique go much easier. And we won't have those extra layers of fabric behind the half circle. To prepare the half circles on the block to allow us to make a final stitch on the edge, I'm going to use some HeatNBond LIte, some little half rings to adhere them to the block. I traced out 8 of them from my little template. Now I just need to cut these out, and we'll just double check one here on one of our half circles to make sure that the size looks right. I have all 8 cut out and ready to go. We'll just press this HeatNBond LIte onto each of our half circles. And when we pull this off, we should see that solid area of adhesive along the edge of our half circle. And now I'll just line this up and place it between the 2 pressing mats for the HeatNBond LIte and press. Here are all 8 of the half compass blocks and the 2 color variations with that half circle adhered with the HeatNBond LIte. And as I mentioned in a previous video in this series, due to some of my vision challenges with up close, Sherry's been very kind to add this finishing stitch for me. Our pattern on page 5 has a step D, it's 3D, and this is preparing the block for applique. So we're cutting a half circle of freezer paper, and we're going to take the block with the wrong side facing us, and we're going to center this half circle of freezer paper so that it doesn't cut off the tips, right? We have these intersecting seams on the back. We can see where the tips of the compass are at there. And so what I'm going to do is center the half circle of freezer paper and try to make equal spacing on each side and all the way around as best I can. And of course we'll press our freezer paper onto the back of the block, and then we'll go ahead and cut this out around the edge. But first I'm going to double check that I'm not cutting off any of the points of the compass. I brought the light box over, and you can clearly see the freezer paper on the back. It can go to each of our points and just double check them. We definitely don't want to cut our point off, right? So if we cut 3/8 of an inch beyond the freezer paper, we should be fine. They may not be entirely uniform because with the bias of fabric and all these angles that we have involved, then we could have some issues with some distortion somewhere, right? So I definitely, being not that seasoned of a quilter, I wouldn't expect them to come out 100% accurate. But at least this way, the wax from the freezer paper is not on the front of our fabric of our finished block. It's just going to get on the back. So we'll cut 3/8 of an inch along that edge of that freezer paper, and we'll see what we get. And the pattern tells us after doing this that we'll fold the 3/8 inch edge that we left over the freezer paper edge and press it. So while we have the freezer paper still on, we can go ahead and get this edge pressed, give us a crease. Next, the pattern is telling us to pin this edge, fold it over and pin it. But this is going to be sitting around for a while before I get the rest of this quilt done. So I think instead I'm going to use this basting tape, and I'm going to put some basting tape just along that edge inside that crease, and then fold it down and press it against that basting tape. I think this would take up a lot of our pins, and we don't really have that many pins in the pin cushion. It seems like the spacing is about right to leave an 1/8 inch between that basting tape and the crease. And it leaves enough room for the tape to catch the fabric when we fold it over and it not to come up. The one thing I would say about folding this over is this is probably somewhat of an art thing, to not get any lumpy, bumpy areas in your curve of the fold. Here's a look at one of those up close. Here's a quick look at all 8 of the blocks with the curved edge pressed and folded over and adhered with the basting tape. Now they're good for safekeeping until I can get the rest of the quilt ready to assemble it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. This is a very interesting and challenging project. Please leave any comments you have, as well as give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. On the next video in this series, I'll be working on the quarter compass blocks. So in the meantime, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.